Hi everyone, and welcome to part 3 of Station 11, which focuses on Miranda and her relationship with Arthur. So the start of part 3 really is the beginning of the relationship with Arthur and Miranda, and by the end of that, it is totally finished and ended quite bitterly after she discovers that Arthur has been cheating on her. So let's get into it. We're basically going to run it the same way we did part 2, where I just want you to choose 2 of the following slides and complete the activities on them. And you'll see at the end, it gives you some suggestions for the creative response you might do if you're basing it on part 3. So, first one, chapter 13. So that picks up directly after the end of part 2, chapter 12, where we finish with that image of the photo in Kirsten's backpack. So the one where Miranda is walking out of the restaurant and the big camera flash goes off and it sort of blinds her and she's wearing her sunnies. And that's exactly where it picks up in chapter 13. Okay, so Mandel uses that present to jump us back to the past. In chapter 13, we get more of Mandel's beautiful descriptive writing. So really clearly establishing that setting of Delano Island, which sounds, like quite the paradise, okay? Um, that's the question I want you to think about for this one. Why Mandel chooses that photo, the one of Miranda leaving the restaurant. Why that one is the one that Kirsten carries around. So is it, maybe there's some parallels you could draw between those characters, or just think about the significance of that one. We also get this insight into Arthur. He is the voice, if you like, in chapter 13. We talk about one of the features of Mandel's writing being what we call a close third person narrative. Okay, and so what that means is even though it's told in third person, there's this omniscient narrator. At times, Mandel gives us insight into what the character's thinking. So if you have a look on page 74, we get this really clear sense of Arthur's voice just at the end of that first kind of section there before the page break in the middle. He tells them it is, and then finds a way to change the subject because it's difficult to explain this next part. Yes, it was beautiful. It was the most beautiful place I have ever seen. It was gorgeous and claustrophobic. I loved it and I always wanted to escape. So that's a close third person, getting us a sense of how special Delano Island is to Arthur. Okay, so she's not using talking marks, she's not making an eye all of a sudden, but that's sort of drifting into Arthur's head. So I would highly recommend in your creative writing that you're using that as a text feature. Okay, a close third person narrative. Anyway, that was a little tangent for you, but you want to think about the fact that both Arthur and Miranda come from this place. They want to escape. They're looking for something. They're looking for this bigger world. Okay, so think about this question here. What's the significance of Arthur and Miranda coming from the same small place? Okay, Arthur loves New York because nobody knows him there. All right, so it's about that escape. In chapter 14, we are introduced to that comic that is quite significant, obviously, in this text. Okay, and you can think about the parallel between Miranda and her main character, Dr. 11, a character who's out of place, doesn't feel like they belong. Okay, so think about some of this. This is a comic about an alien civilization that basically destroys Earth. Everyone has to flee, and we just have a small group of survivors. Okay, so there are pretty obvious parallels with the real world, inverted commas, that Mandel presents to us. Okay, after the Georgia flu. So that's what I want you to think about there. This chapter gives us a really clear sense of how important the Station 11 comic is to Miranda. She tells Pablo, okay, her ex, you don't have to understand it, it's mine. Okay, so that's what I want you to think about. What does Station 11 mean to Miranda? Think about when she draws. Okay, that might give you some hints there as well. Miranda's mantra is, I repent nothing. So I want you to think about what does that tell us about this character. And the reason I want you to think about Miranda as a character is that she's a really good one to work on and to take that perspective of for the creative response. So you have to make sure you really understand her if you're going to write from her point of view. In chapter 15, we get that dinner party scene. Okay, so this is the disaster that basically is the end of Miranda and Arthur's relationship. Okay, don't forget that they're there after all. The dinner party is because it's their third wedding anniversary, so 3 years of marriage. Okay, And so, yeah, it's pretty gross when we discover that Arthur has been having an affair with Elizabeth, probably for some time. We get the sense, and Miranda has that pretty horrible realization that a lot of the other dinner party guests know that that's been going on. So what you want to do here is have a look at how that evening goes down. We have the dinner party. Miranda goes outside because she wants freedom. She doesn't like the people she's stuck talking to. Arthur won't even look at her, and we can understand why later. She has a conversation with Jeevan, who's waiting. He's a paparazzo, after all, don't forget by this point. And later, she's in her studio, and Elizabeth comes in, and they talk about Station 11. Okay, so what I want you to do with this one, if you choose chapter 15, I want you to talk about the involvement of each of those characters in the scene. So to recap, I want you to talk about Arthur, Miranda, Elizabeth, Jeevan, and Clark. Okay, so Clark's not in a whole lot, but he does lend that sympathetic ear, if you like, with some sort of reassurance to Miranda. Mandel jolts us out of that past and brings us crashing back to the present, if you like, of the post-plague world with chapters 16 and 18. So these take the form of an interview between Francois Diallo, who's a journalist, or he's trying to sort of maintain a library, and Kirsten. And so what I want you to think about is why Mandel would structure it like that. All of a sudden, we're taken out of that story to be brought back to the present. Think about the themes and ideas that are introduced here, okay? And what Mandel might be trying to get us to think about, get you to consider maybe some ideas like memory and nostalgia, because after all, there are lots of objects in particular that anchor Kirsten to Miranda. So the comics and the paperweight are two obvious ones. So based on that, I want you to look at the interview and how it goes, and just start the beginning of the newspaper report that Diallo would write coming out of those interviews. Chapter 17 takes us back to the past, okay, and we get another little insight into Arthur. Okay, so this is his catch up with Clark, another dinner, and another disaster, if you like. So really part 3 gets us to maybe question our reading of Arthur. We get to see some, pretty unlikable traits and some unlikable aspects of his character. I want you to think about why Mandel writes this part in the present, okay? And then also consider, Arthur really is, wanting to escape, but he's looking for fame, and his kind of desire to be known, it shifts obviously over the course of his life, okay? So think about if you're writing from Arthur at this stage in his life, his values are going to be very different from that as we see him in chapter 1. We know that there's a lot of Shakespeare in this text. Obviously, the Travelling Symphony perform a lot of Shakespearean plays. What you may not know is that Miranda is actually a character in another of Shakespeare's plays called The Tempest. So I want you to have a look at how her character might compare to what we see in that play. You can jump onto Wikipedia, or you might look at SparkNotes or something like that, just to find out what The Tempest is about, get a quick sense of plot, and then see if you can make some connections between that and Station 11. And then finally, we come to our creative responses. So what you might do for this part of Station 11. So first one, you might write another interview between Diallo and Kirsten. And you might look at instead this Museum of Civilization. Okay, so what's going on there after, Kirsten has visited and seen what, Clark has managed to build. They could have a discussion about that. You might go back to that dinner party and look at it from another character's perspective, Arthur or Clark. But don't forget that these perspectives are going to be very, very different. So Clark is pretty disgusted with Arthur's behavior at the dinner party. Like some of those other guests, he's worked out that Arthur's having an affair with Elizabeth. So you've got to try to reflect that in your writing. You've got to get a sense of, how Clark feels about his old friend. On the other hand, Arthur, very, very different here. He doesn't want to look at Miranda, so maybe there's a sense of guilt in him, but at the same time, he doesn't want to deal with this breakdown in his relationship. Towards the end of this part, Miranda confronts Arthur and says, you know, we need to talk. He brushes her off and goes to bed. So the Arthur we see in part 3 is very different to the Arthur we see in other parts of the text. So you've got to think about what he's like at this point and make sure you reflect that accurately, okay? I would argue that he's not feeling too bad about the end of this relationship, okay? He's a pretty selfish guy. You also could look at Arthur and Clark's catch-up, switch it, look at Arthur's point of view, and don't forget, by this point in the play, he's loving the text. He's loving the fact that he's recognized. Okay, he's got the fame that he's been after. Okay, but he wants to be seen. So again, he's a very different Arthur from the Arthur who is old and having regrets and then wanting to reconnect with Tyler. Okay, so make sure you're capturing that in your voice. The last option you might consider here, we don't get a real sense of what happens to Miranda from the point she leaves Pablo. She's staying with Arthur in the hotel in Toronto. To them, all of a sudden, 3 years later, they're married and they're living in Hollywood. So what are the sorts of decisions that they might have made there? So you might either look at Arthur's perspective there or Miranda's. We know that, you know, Miranda comes to feel very, very out of place in her time in LA, in Hollywood. So you might want to write about that experience for her. So that's it for this one. It's over to you now. As I said, make sure, like you did with part 2, you choose 2 of the slides here and you complete those activities for 2 of those chapters. And you might consider for your creative response due on Friday, 1 of these 4 options. So I will check in with you again in the double. Otherwise, enjoy and I'll see you then.